The recording of this class started about 30 seconds after Dr. Bonnette actually started. So you have the sense of coming into the class already in motion.
Replace the race. I mean, people say it was just love. It's curious that the Creator made sure that love took place in such a fashion that procreation also took place at the same time. So, conceivably the method of expression of the greatest love could have been separated from the procreative act. But it isn't, at least in our species. I don't know, maybe there's some Martians somewhere that are different, but that's how it is for us, and that therefore determines that the nature of marriage, as we saw in the previous class, ironically enough, is all about sex. It's all about reproduction. And you cannot separate it from that, which of course means that some of the modern day tinkering with the concept of marriage is rather ill-conceived, to cite a slight pun there. Number 5, so marriage is determined by nature, not by man's will. It is a unique institution because it has a unique end, and the end is the production of new live man, which seems a little strange way of putting it, but that determines the nature of the institution itself. Interestingly enough, as it says here, parents teach the children, but children also teach the parent. You get an experience in life like you've never had before when you become a parent. And of course, understandably, as many people may realize, you change your entire perspective on life once you are married and have children, because it's a rude awakening that the whole world doesn't revolve around yourself. And this is why the transition is so difficult for people, and also why for many people it's very difficult if they marry late in life. Once you've learned to be completely self-absorbed, it's awful hard to realize that everything that you're going to do from now on involves another person or persons, and that your actions have to be primarily oriented for their good, not only for your own good. Marriage entails a number of common goods. The first and primary one, of course, is the child, the new human person that you're bringing into the world, not merely at birth, but one that you are going to prepare through education to become a functioning member of the body politic. Among the other common goods, though, are the things that people sometimes confuse with the entire essence of marriage. Things like harmony between the spouses and between the children. Of course, bear in mind this is an ideal. It doesn't always happen, and doesn't always happen all the time, but this is what we're supposed to be living up to. Security, there is a security in knowing that there are others who love you and who care for you and you care for them. Love itself. Peace, of course, which we hope to retain. Respect for the family name. That's why you don't want Cousin Harry to wind up in jail. He's got the same last name that you do. So we have a common concern to uphold our family name because it's mutually beneficial. Education takes place within the family, not only, of course, in the raising of the children, but as I just mentioned, in terms of the parents themselves becoming educated through the very process of raising a family and participating in a family. Order, you have to have order, you have to have discipline, you have to have authority and obedience within the marital and conjugal and domestic unit, society. And of course, as you continue to have more children down the line, you develop a family lineage. And that's why my sister in Michigan spends all her time doing genealogy on people she'll never know. She can trace us all the way back through Quebec, back to France somewhere. Of course, I had another friend who claimed he could trace himself back to Adam and Eve, but so certainly at least to the English royal family. Point number 7, schooling, please note, is not the same thing as education. Schooling is the instrument for education. And education, if you notice the word educare, it's from a meaning out of or from, and ducare, to lead. So education is not the same thing as training, not like a dog hopping through hoops that you use Pavlovian psychology on. Education is a matter of presenting options to a child, showing them how things work, getting them to participate in the learning process so that it is truly a leading and a following on the part of the child. Schooling is a method that we use for education, but schooling, if it's formal outside the home, of course, is only a small part of a child's day. Most of the day is spent within the home. The advantage, of course, to homeschooling is that you have the ideal situation in which you constantly have the integration of the values of the family with the educational process. Point F, we need two parents, and they can't be of the same sex for obvious reasons, because each parent represents half of the human race. That's why you need, just as half the human race is male and half is female, you need to have a male and a female parent, father and mother. And this is why homosexual marriage, so-called, does not meet this extremely critical aspect of the educative process. Top of page 33, number G, or letter G. There are 4 steps to sensitive love. And these are kind of evident. Everybody who's an adult, of course, knows pretty well how these work. First, you want to be in the presence of the person with whom you're interested. You want to be in the presence of the person whom you love. You want them around you. You're not trying to chase them away. You're not trying to get down to the bar on Saturday night so you can get away from them. But to begin with, you want them to be around, and you're always thinking of being in their presence. Secondly, there's a kind of jealousy that develops in the sense that you kind of want them exclusively. You don't want to share your time with anybody else in the process. Thirdly, of course, there is the process of touch, which, as we described in a previous class, ultimately leads to sexual union. Everybody pretty well understands this romantic definition and description of love and romance and where it all leads to. But the difficulty with it is, like all good things, I don't want to say it comes to an end, but it wears off. What we're talking about is what one might term initially a kind of infatuation, which leads to a very deep kind of physiological, psychological love that we've been describing here. The problem is, I don't want to say it wears off, but it kind of does. After about a year and a half, if that's all you've got going, it no longer is quite as thrilling as it once was. And if that's all you've got going, you got the horrible danger that there might be somebody else who is new and fresh and exciting and really a lot more interesting than this person that you really are terribly used to. And that is why it is so critical that a transition is made. That during this period of natural, physiological, physical, romantic love and involvement that you have, we have to simultaneously begin to develop a deep kind of spiritual relationship with that person. Intellective love, love that is based upon principle and understanding and a kind of spiritual depth that the purely physiological and psychological cannot touch. This is what makes the transition from that initial romantic stage to the permanent, lifelong union whereby people stay together literally until death. This is what makes it work. And the wonderful, wonderful little secret of all this is that if you make that transition to the spiritual kind of love, the initial romantic love will continue and blossom and bloom and strengthen as time goes on, because you now see this person as unique and irreplaceable. It's like telling somebody, go. You love your spouse. All right, well, couldn't you just love another person just as well? Not if you really love them. Not if you really know the meaning of love. Love means I love you, this irreplaceable, unique person with whom I am in love. I can't just say, well, I'll get you a doppelganger. I'll get you somebody absolutely equal and identical, and maybe a little bit smarter too. But the problem is, it's not the same person. I'm in love with you, not with somebody just like you. My concern would be for your good, your welfare. What is love? By the way, what is love? What do you mean by love? Everybody says I love you, right and left. What does it mean to love? I had a whole course as an undergraduate called The Philosophy of Love. You can have a whole course on it. But basically, it means one fundamental thing. What is it? Everybody says I love you. It's like saying they know what marriage is, but nobody can define it. George?
You will the good of the other.
Absolutely. It is to intend the good of another person. And in that sense, you can love all your fellow men, even the ones you don't like, even the ones you can't stand. But you know, because God has created them, that there's an ineluctable value within their being that is worthy of love and may ultimately be worthy of justice. But there's something about them, as long as they're living, there's something that could be potentially lovable there. And that's why, God loves us infinitely on his part. Our problem is that we represent a potency that is only just so lovable. God loves infinitely, but we're not infinitely lovable. But he loves us as much as we can be loved. And so too it is. This intellective love is to intend the good of the other person in sickness and in health and wealth and poverty and so forth. It is a commitment to stick to that person and promote what is good for them. Always, no matter how difficult it is, even if it is impossible to have conjugal love with them, even if they're stuck in a prison in a foreign country. That's the meaning of true love. So intellective love produces the lasting love of marriage, and it increases sensitive love, so that sensitive love between people who truly have learned to love each other doesn't just wash away. Understandably, in our narcissistic society that we're in today, small wonder marriages have a hard time lasting, because it's very hard for people to make that transition to that kind of lasting love that is appropriate to marriage itself. H, domestic society. Domestic is from the Latin domus, meaning a home. So we distinguish, I don't know if we've done it yet, but we distinguish between the conjugal society, which is just the male and female, the husband and wife, and when you bring the child into the picture, you now have the familial society, which is the domestic society, because you have a home, you have parents, and a child or children. So in the familial society, you have, as it says, it takes, let's say, 21 years to raise that son or daughter. Love cements, but it's not the purpose of marriage. Remember, the purpose is drawn from that all-encompassing procreative finality, which is what it's all about, why God created this institution in the unique manner in which it exists. Yes, you've got to have love. Yes, you've got to have all those other common goods. And that's what confuses people when you ask them, what is the definition of marriage? They say, well, you've got to love this other person. And the problem, of course, is that you love a lot of people. You love a lot of people, but you don't marry them all, or at least you shouldn't. As they say, we don't practice polygamy in this country, simultaneous polygamy. We practice sequential polygamy. And then, of course, the conjugal society, which really precedes the familial society, means con, to together, and the eugal part of it refers to joining, to join together two people. And of course, they are joined together so that everything is shared in common. The common goods of the husband and wife, mutual love and aid, and also, yes, what's known as that natural remedy for concupiscence. It's kind of curious when you say marriage is about sex, but you have to remember that there are two aspects to the sex. One is the production of the child. The other is the alleviation of concupiscence, which would leave society in a rather barbaric fashion if there were not some natural institution whereby to rein it in. And of course, today we've lost the reins, by and large, unfortunately. The obligations derived from the end of marriage, always focusing on that end. Number one, the physical sustenance of the children. You've created them, brought them into this world, therefore there is an obligation to care for them. Keep the little so-and-sos alive. Educate them, but care particularly for their physical well-being to begin with. Clothe them, feed them according to their needs and their state in life. This seems to go without saying. And again, a lot of things we're saying are completely self-evident. The problem is that we live in a society in which the understanding has been warped at its root, and therefore all these things that are kind of self-evident get misunderstood in their application. And we tend to get the cart before the horse. We tend to think, for example, if you can't give your child a 4-year college education, it's better they shouldn't exist. Don't bring them into the world if you can't give them a baccalaureate degree. See, that completely misses the point. Life is more important than education. And bringing them into the world is more important than making sure that they make out, like the president of a company. The education of the child, physical, intellectual, and moral. You teach them all the little things, from learning how to tie their shoes and how to feed themselves. The first 5 years or so, you think children are just learning, are just playing. But playing is learning how to do all the things we take for granted later on. For example, when a child, how long it takes them to learn how to just drink out of a cup? It's a mess to begin with, isn't it? But just think about the fact that the people who run the computers have had a terrible time figuring out how to make a robot that can drink successfully. It's really difficult. It's easy to make a robot that can answer questions, but to get them not to spill a glass of water, that's really hard to do. And without short-circuiting all their electronics too. But children, when they're playing, that's their job. Because in playing, they learn the laws of physics, sometimes the hard way. That's why the difficulty they've had sometimes when they watch the Saturday morning cartoons, because in the cartoons, the characters do things that violate the laws of physics. The old classical problem was the children that watched Peter Pan and then would try to fly. This became very disastrous at times. And you see these cartoon characters get run over by a steamroller and get up and keep running. It doesn't work too well if you're a human being and it's a real steamroller. But yes, education entails, where did I lose my place here? Where was I? Oh, okay, I found it. Yeah, I didn't want to lose the next line there. Education is not just physical, it's not just teaching them to become clever, but also teaching them to become good. That's why the Catholic school system was founded in the United States back in, I think it was 1881, a third plenary session at Baltimore. The bishops met, and they said we need to have a universal school system in this country so that children learn not only to be clever, but also good. Too often today, the only emphasis is on making them clever. And they may be a clever serial killer, but that doesn't make them good members of society. So education, to be true education, is education in the virtues as well as in just speculative academic things. And then, of course, we come to sex education, which we're not really dealing with in this course directly, but as far as sex education, one of the major points to notice here is that in the home, parents are teaching their children about sex education all the time, just by giving a proper example of the loving relationship between themselves and in relation to their children, and the dignity with which they treat all the members of the family. That's sex education of the best sort. Sex education primarily is a matter of learning a few basic principles of ethics, not the biological, mechanical techniques of sexual behavior or misbehavior. As it says here, you don't necessarily have to give formal sex education, but you simply have to answer questions truthfully. Of course, today you have to anticipate the questions about 5 years ahead of where you thought you had to, unfortunately. And it is a very difficult world in which we are now living, and it's one where many parents are shocked to find what their children have been exposed to. Even the common little practice that people have of letting their children sleep over with others, this is an extremely dangerous thing to do, because you have no idea what kind of formation those others may have, no matter how good you think it may be, no matter how good a family you may think they are. This is an extremely dumb thing to do in both directions, I dare say.
You'd be surprised to see what even video games the kids are playing nowadays. You know, I substitute in schools, and you have second graders that are playing mature video games that are supposed to be for 17 years and older. And then you know they pose a question to you, and you really don't want to touch it because you know that they're not supposed to be playing those games. You know, it's where you sort of need to draw the line. You're not going to go and step into that territory. And you try to educate the parent to the best of your ability. You know, they really shouldn't be playing these sort of games. Or even just watching TV shows. I mean, I have a lot of students too that'll come up to me and will mention an inappropriate television show they're watching, and I think in the back of my head, why are you letting them watch this?
Well, this is why many people have trashed their televisions as the only effective means of parental control. It's really a sad day and age when you consider the wonders of this technology that were envisioned, for example, at the time of Vatican II, as being a means of bringing virtuous education to the entire world. And look what it's turned into. It certainly has not turned into an instrument of God. I think one can well imagine whose instrument it is. We can come back to some of those points later on. J, very important point. Parents alone have the direct right to educate the child. Remember, yes, that door locks from the outside. Good evening, Tom. Good to have you. You have to remember what a right is. A right is a moral power to fulfill an obligation. Parents have the primary right to oversee the raising of their children, not because they are made commanders-in-chief by God for some purely authoritative reason, but precisely because parents are responsible for the acts which brought these children into the world. They're responsible for the procreative act, which provides the physical reality of the child, God, of course, creating the spiritual soul. But it is because they have engaged in the activity that has brought the child into the world that they are then primarily responsible. They primarily have the obligation to care for that child and to raise them to adulthood. And it's because they have this obligation primarily that they have the correlative right to fulfill the obligation. And that means that no one else may arbitrarily and unjustly or without extremely good cause interfere with their exercise of that right. So again, you have to assemble the ethical foundation properly, or else you're going to wind up with idiots saying that it takes a village to raise a child. I don't know anybody who'd say that, but this is the idea, of course, which horrifically took place under the Nazis, where they were so brainwashing the children that they were teaching them to report their parents to the Gestapo if they did this or that kind of action. This is a complete inversion of society, and bear in mind, I'll say it now and we're going to probably say it many times again, the family, the conjugal and domestic unit, is the primary society. It is the essential natural society which is the building block for every other kind of civil society. And that is precisely why, because it is such a strong natural institution, totalitarian governments do all in their power to undermine and destroy the family. I dare say, whether it was intended as such, and I suspect it was, all you have to do is look at what's happened in the last 40 or 50 years, especially in our own country, and you can see the family has been virtually vanquished by forces from every angle, much of it quite deliberate. But I don't want to sound paranoid. You don't really need a conspiracy theory to see the effect and to recognize that fewer and fewer children are being raised in a family unit with a husband and wife. And today we define marriage in terms of whoever's legally married. I hesitate to think how many people are really husbands and wives, that is to say, have only been married once to each other, and this is a natural family unit. It's no repeat offenders here. So if you ask in those terms how many children are being raised in that kind of family, I don't think I'd want to know the answer. I don't know it, but I suspect it's probably less than 25%. If anybody's got a number, please throw it out. It's probably right. But that's why we say parents alone have the direct right to educate the child. The state and even the church have only an indirect right, and this primarily in the form of removing impediments to the function which parents have. That is to say, the state and the church have a right to try to protect the child from, say, abusive parents, and there are some, and also to make sure that the education is adequate. But that doesn't mean that the state has the primary right to educate the child. And the primary protector of the child is the parent. And that's why under normal circumstances, unless there's clear and judicially provable abuse, a parent ought to have the right to determine what is appropriate for the education of his child. It is not the state's right to educate the child. That's the totalitarian view. The problem is that where you have the state unlawfully inserting itself into the education, this violates the parental rights, and in practice, as we've seen in the case of the public school system, it winds up costing a lot more than it should. And to what effect? Palpably, it appears to be not to a very good effect. The state has the right to protect notice protect, not interfere with, but to protect the reproduction of society, and it has the right and the obligation, because remember, rights flow from obligations, it has the obligation to protect society itself. So the state has an obligation to defend civil society, say from an outside invading army. The state has an obligation, and this is the obligation, to protect the family, to protect its rights, to protect its autonomy. Quite the opposite of the modern progressive state that tends to interfere with and supplant and replace the family and parental authority to the detriment of the children themselves. Point number 2 here under J, some parents can contract with the state to educate their children. But this does not impose an obligation on other parents to pay for it. What this, of course, is referring to is a public school system. If you want to send your children to the public school, and if the public school has been established for certain purposes, kind of interesting to note that I think it's been observed that the state-run school system is the one major vestige that we have in common with the Soviet Union or with the Nazis. The whole idea that the state is going to educate your children is not indigenous to a democratic or republican form of government. Everything else is done by free enterprise. Everything else is done by voluntary actions of individuals acting together for their common purposes. Their individual private societies that they're formed. But when it comes to the education, it is taken as the norm that one sends one's children to the public school, unless you happen to be rich enough to be able to send them to a private school. The problem is if parents try to exercise, and you already know this, if they exercise their parental authority and try to send their children to a private school or to a private religious school or to a Catholic school or a Jewish school or a Lutheran school, they are rewarded by getting to pay not only the tuition to the school to which they're sending their children, but also the taxes to pay for the tuition to send the children to the public school. I'm realizing in Canada they have a slightly different system where the money follows the children, but that's not the case in the United States. In the United States, the money follows the IRS. And you're lucky to get any of it back. This, of course, is something that's frequently violently misunderstood by people when we talk about, well, let's provide, say, school buses to the Catholic schools. You'll have many people who send their children to public schools and say, why should my tax dollar go to paying for sending Johnny to a Catholic school on that yellow bus? And of course, they just don't understand that the poor people who are sending their children to that Catholic school are paying the tuition at the Catholic school and paying for the payment to support their own children in the public school. So the argument is completely reversed from the truth. The truth that is that the parents of the private school children are doubly taxed for the privilege of trying to be, frankly, better parents. Three, education means developing the capacities of the intellectual and moral virtues right up to the point of virtue. We've said this before, but it bears saying again that education means raising the child, leading the child, until they basically are mature enough to survive in society by themselves. But when they come to that point, they need to possess the virtues of a good human being if they are to survive and to thrive properly within society, both from the standpoint of society, because after all, society doesn't want a cleverly educated John Dillinger, and conversely from the standpoint of their own good, both in terms of living well and happily in this life and preparing for their last end in the life to come after this life. Totalitarianism, the children are educated for the state. Top of page 34. On the contrary, we belong first to the family and only secondarily to society. K, the negative parental obligations are kind of obvious. One, don't abuse your child. Unfortunately, what has happened in some cases is that in order to prevent child abuse, we have caused child abuse. There was a case not that long ago, I believe in Buffalo, where a family, well, it may be 10 or 15 years now, but where somebody had reported to the sex abuse hotline a family, and the state agency was thereby empowered to knock on their door at 2 a.m. and come in and sexually examine their children, thereby submitting them to horrendous psychological trauma in the name of protecting them. And the way that the system worked is that it was very difficult for the family to undo this reporting process. So one has to be horribly careful that you're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, by trying to protect children to the point that you actually expose them to greater difficulty. Now, that doesn't mean that there is not a proper function for child protective services, but it should be a good child protective services that is extremely sensitive to the psychological well-being of those little children that they're supposed to protect, and that is not also very concerned about respecting the privacy and the rights of the family at the same time. Number 2, obviously you're not supposed to give scandal to the family. You're not supposed to become an alcoholic in raising your children or allow the use of illicit drugs. And of course, particularly today, you have to be concerned about allowing your children to be exposed to pornography, which also probably almost means you not only have to throw out the TV set, but your computer too. I mean, it's almost impossible. My son, who is a software computer, well, he has his own company, doing this, pointed out to me the other day, one thing that they really could do that could help would be to basically, I'm not quite sure how he stated it, I may have the technical aspect incorrect, but he said basically they should prevent access to the providers that are coming out of places like Russia or Uganda or some of the places where we're getting a lot of our pornography from, because you can't regulate them. You have the possibility of regulating the providers, the websites in the United States and Canada, but you can't regulate those that are coming from some of these foreign countries over which we have no control whatever. So that might help, but of course, it is a very great and daunting problem for most parents to figure out how to protect their children today from a dozen directions. It's a challenge that is enough to give good parents nightmares. Section 17, the properties of the marriage bond. Now, remember, the bond is the form of the union. The form is determined by the final cause. The final cause is the procreation and education of children to replace the race. So the form of the marriage union, the bond, the contract, is, remember, that scandalous definition, that you are exchanging with each other the right to those physical acts which are apt to the procreation of children. So marriage is for sex, but understood properly. Understood properly. Now we're going to talk about the properties of the bond. And that's where love and care and understanding and all these common goods we've been talking about come into play. Property is a per se accident. It is something that flows from the essence of a thing. You can never have the thing without having the property. It's just like a triangle by its very nature has 3 sides and 3 angles. But having one of those 3 angles, although it's a property of it, does not define the triangle itself. but it's an essential property of it. If you're going to have a triangle, you've got to have all three angles. So what we're looking at here are certain properties. They belong to the nature of marriage, but they're not its very definition. They're not the nature of the contract itself. And two of these, two essential properties are, one, exclusivity, that is, one on one, meaning one male and one female, period. You don't get to fool around with that arrangement. And two, permanence. It's not a one-night fling. It's a lot longer than that. It's a permanent union. It's for keeps. So exclusivity and permanence. Now, what does this mean specifically? Number one, regarding the exclusivity, it says here, against unity. Well, the unity is the exclusivity. It's these two people alone forming that bond. Polygamy violates the exclusivity of the marriage bond. Now, polygamy is divided. The poly, you understand, meaning many. But that poly is divided into two forms, polyandry and polygyny. Polyandry, from the Greek anthropos, meaning man, means...
Professor, the word is poly, many, yes, but the aner, Greek has two words for man, the same way that Latin does.
Right.
Homo in Latin, the
Right.
human being,
And
and then
vir.
the male human being. Greek is anthropos, the human being,
And
aner, andros, the
andros.
male human being.
Okay, I was tempted to say andros, but I was thinking, wait, it's anthropos also.
Yes, yes.
But, okay, so this would mean then many males to one female. Polygyny is the opposite, where you have many females and one male. Polyandry is so perverse that it's virtually unfound. It's virtually unfound, even in most primitive societies. The problem probably as to why it's rarely ever seen is because of testosterone. Males will kill each other. If you have multiple males, they'll kill each other. It just, it's not going to work. The closest you have to it is maybe some African tribes where it's understood that if a guest comes over, you lend him your wife. That's sort of a variation on the theme. If you're really polite and understanding and don't have much testosterone. Also, it's very, it's unhealthy. It tends to lead to sterility on the part of the female. Now, given the fact that, first of all, females are at a premium because one male can fertilize many females, but one female can only have a certain number of children. So wasting a whole bunch of men on one female is highly unproductive, if you see what I mean. And most you're going to get maybe 30 children.
There's a song in The King and I that explains that.
Yes, there is. I remember it. And the king wins the song,
Yeah.
remember? Because
the
his
bee,
harem
the bee
is...
goes to the flowers, but the flowers can't go to the bee.
and the king can have, 600 children.
Yeah.
Whereas, what was her name? Kerr? Who played? Deborah Kerr. Yeah. She could only have 30 at most. Obviously, an inferior process. So, all right, good. Polyandry you just about don't find. Polygyny is a different matter and a bit more delicate to deal with. Polygyny, of course, also is not universally found, or it's not even widely found in society. The anthropologists going back and looking at primitive society thought they would find, according to evolution, that people were just made at random, just like animals. That isn't what they found. They have found, by and large, for the most part, almost everywhere, monogamous relationships prevail. And even if you get something like polygyny, it is not an original state of things. The problem, as you fully are aware, I'm dancing around this a little bit because we have the patriarchs of the Old Testament who were allowed, because of the hardness of their hearts, to have many wives, or at least multiple wives. And part of the reason for that is because it doesn't violate the reproductive aim of nature, for the very reason that it's the reverse of polyandry. You could have one male inseminate many females and be quite productive. But it's certainly not a proper way to do things in terms of the beauty of the relationship of love between two individual people. Also, it's counterproductive because what you wind up with is the people who are able to afford a harem, to put it bluntly, tend to be, the old, fat, rich guy who is really not going to be terribly productive in terms of his genetic capacities compared to all these poor, young, virile people who can't get themselves a harem. So it's not even really a healthy situation for society, even if one tolerated it. In practice, polygyny isn't a perfectly democratic circumstance. Even as we know from the practice of the Mormons before they abandoned it, it doesn't mean a perfectly equivalent situation, and it isn't even ideal from the standpoint of the male. For example, if you had 3 or 4 wives, you had, for a certain period of time, whether it was a week or a month, one of them was the primary wife. You had to keep rotating them. You probably didn't like them all equally either, so this was not a perfect circumstance. But again, it violates the unity because just as the males will be jealous and perhaps kill each other, the women will be jealous and they'll find their ways to make life miserable too. So it's not an ideal circumstance. And I think didn't we just have a scandal a few years ago about children that were being raised in a polygamous cult? And
Texas, I think.
yeah, and it was really pretty horrendous. Regardless of what came of it, it's again, it is not good for the children because again, you're going to have jealousy and conflict as to whose child belongs to which mother and so forth. So while it doesn't intrinsically violate the institution of marriage as to its last end, and therefore may have been tolerated by God for some good reason for a period of time, it is not something that should be sanctioned by man on his own authority. And hence it is appropriately excluded from society today. Of course, as I said, the problem is we don't have simultaneous polygamy, we have legalized sequential polygamy instead. Point number 2, divorce. Divorce is against the permanence of marriage. Of course, what we're looking at here is the a priori argument. It's interesting. I don't know if this is still the case. It probably isn't, but according to the 1990 U.S. Census, only 20% of the people who get married have divorces. Now, the problem is a lot of people don't get married, and a lot of the people who do get divorced are repeat offenders. So they marry multiple times, adding up to the number of divorces, if that makes any sense. And probably the statistics are worse now. We mentioned this before. If it takes, say, 21 years to educate a child, it's going to, if you get married when you're around 20, you're going to be about 40 by the time the first child has been brought to maturity. And by then, you may have had more children, so that's going to take you to 50, 55 or so. And by then, really that's kind of a little bit late in life to be starting off hunting again. And it may be disadvantageous. I don't want to say which sex, but it could be. disadvantageous to one sex rather than the other. So it doesn't hardly seem to be fair game. This runs, of course, against all the romanticism which has been put out in favor of divorce. I think it was C.S. Lewis who wrote a wonderful little piece against divorce, but he said that you could, in the name of the romantic love today, you could justify anything as long as it ended up with 4 bare legs and a bed. That's how he put it. So when you as television, as popular journalism today eulogizes the glories of romantic love, it tends to, of course, violate and denigrate and undermine the stability of true, intellective, lasting marital love, much to the effect that today many people, I think they just had statistics come out just yesterday indicating that many people just aren't getting married anymore. In some ways the divorce rate is down because there aren't as many people bothering to get married. They just live together. And of course you also have the problem, for example, that many young men don't want to get married because they figure it's going to wind up in divorce, and all I'm going to wind up doing is having to make child payments for some child I can't even see. So they prefer just not to get married. This is where we've come to. We started, of course, back in the 30s and 40s, permitting divorce in the United States at least, under rare circumstances where you could prove adultery. But as anything else we know in ethics, if you have one exception to a rule, what happens to the rule? There's no rule. So if you allow any exceptions, you've destroyed the rule, and of course is what happens and has happened over the last 40, 50, 60 years. So today you can get a divorce because it's like a no-fault car accident. It's not your fault, it's not my fault, we just tear it up and go on to somebody else. The a posteriori argument, in other words, the a priori argument looks at the very nature of marriage and says it ought to be permanent in itself. The a posteriori argument says if you permit divorce, it's really a utilitarian argument, isn't it? If you permit it, you get horrible results in society. Well, that hardly, the sociologists can document it if they want to, but it's self-evident that we've had disastrous effects on both the individual and for the state. And here's the principle. Remember, the primary end is the child. It is unlawful to sacrifice the good of the child or even the bond of marriage in order to achieve better sex and greater comfort. With somebody, I didn't get it right the first time, but I'll get it right the second time. So many people say, I just didn't find my soulmate the first time. It's not my fault. I've learned now, and I'm going to do better. But a posteriori, modern divorce has basically led to a breakdown of marriage. So that normal marriage between one man and one woman for a lifetime has become virtually the exception rather than the rule. And this, of course, leads to what we call, what is it today, the mixed family? There's a better word for it.
Blended family. The
blended family. It means you don't know how to introduce anybody. As I know one circumstance in which a woman had to introduce the son of her husband, or second husband, third husband, to somebody, and she introduced him as her stepson-in-law. If you can figure that one out. I mean, it's a pure fabrication. But it's what the linguistic tour de forces that you're driven to by the circumstances today. Divorce. There are two kinds of divorce, or at least the word divorce is used in two different ways. One, incomplete. It means basically you just separated. separation, sometimes it's necessary. If the husband is beating the daylights out of the wife, she isn't obligated to stay there until he kills her. Sometimes it is necessary to separate, but the meaning of divorce, as we understand civil divorce today, is it is what we call complete divorce, with a right, some alleged right, to remarry. The state claims the power to break the bond. Of course, the bond is not something created by the state, is it? The bond is created as a natural relation created by the male and female, the husband and wife. They created it. The state does not have the authority to break it. The state could legalize separation, a legal separation, in order to protect one of the parties or both parties from their mutual disaffection. But that doesn't mean the state can break the bond itself and permit, therefore, legitimate remarriage. Top of page 35, we're almost going to have to stop here, but this brings up the question of nullity. Nullity, from the Latin nullus, meaning nothing. Well, it means something. It means nothing. It means it never happened. It means the marriage was never confected in the first place. The bond never existed. Why would it never exist? Well, there is a failure to consent in the sense either that there is what we call a defect of the form or the matter. Remember, you got the form and the matter. Defect of form would be entering into the marriage with a deliberate intent that you're never going to procreate. Never, ever. This would not be had just because somebody intends to, say, use contraceptives for a certain period of time. Got to be very careful here. When I can give you the general principle of nullity, but its actual application, you have to be very cautious as to how it is applied. Or it may be a refusal to admit the permanence of marriage. As, of course, many people today just think, well, automatically, if it doesn't work, I'll get married again. If you enter in with that in mind, then, of course, you have not confected or formed the bond. Now, the problem is, you might say, but how many people are thinking when they get married that this is for procreation and it's going to be permanent? Because a lot of people don't think that today. But if they have entered into marriage with the idea, well, I'm marrying, meaning whatever that normally means, they're really not protected against a declaration. They're not, therefore, able to get a declaration of nullity. A declaration of nullity, remember, may come from the state or the church, or both. And the declaration of nullity by the state may not, in fact, be recognized by the church. I suppose conversely, it's also possible that you might not have it recognized by the state, but that's highly unlikely because the state's happy to give a sister.
But you also realize that in order for a church annulment, you must first undergo a civil divorce.
Okay, all right, well that covers, or how about a declaration of nullity?
Or, right.
Yeah. All right, so the church has covered herself with respect to
They
that.
have to show proof. I don't know if when you're talking about nullity here, are you talking through the church?
I'm using the word for both situations.
But the requirement may be different.
Yes,
Okay,
but
because
and the
in
state.
church, it has to be something that you
Yeah.
decided before you married.
I was going to say, some people, what they used to do, really dirty people, what they would do is write a letter to somebody saying, I don't believe that marriage is permanent and I don't expect to ever have a child. And then they'll tell them, now, hang on to that letter in case we need it. You see? So people do all kinds of things, and of course, both on the part of the state officials and even especially more so on the part of the church officials, it's a matter of determining whether this really was something that affected the status of the marriage. But don't think that just because people didn't explicitly avert to procreation and permanence, that therefore they can get out of it. No, because if what you're doing is what you understand, most people understand marriage to be, it is accepted that these things are entailed. And you're not going to get a declaration of nullity that is valid under those circumstances. Let's just do B and then we'll stop. Defect of matter. Well, obviously, if one of the parties was insane at the time of the marriage, or if it's incest, or if one of them was already married, these things, we've already talked about that before. They have to be two people that are really in a position, or if one of them is impotent, if they've got to be in a position where they're able to form the marital bond and to exercise its primary duty effectively. So both of these things one or the other has to be defective in reality to obtain a genuine nullity of the thing. The fact that some people don't exercise the nullity process properly is irrelevant. We're talking about the truth, not the appearance here. And we'll have to terminate for tonight.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.